We'll give it just a minute and let everybody load in. Hi, everyone. We're giving everybody just a few minutes to load in. We have a handful more participants to join. We'll get started in just a minute. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. We've got a handful of more folks joining, but good afternoon and welcome to the Spring Gardening webinar series. It's presented to you today by Central Oregon Master Gardeners, the OSU campus, and all of these lovely sponsors down at the bottom. Thanks so much for joining us today on this very springy April day. My name is Jenny and I'll be your host. Master Gardener volunteer Lisa is helping in the background. And our presenter today is JoAnne Abbott, and she'll be discussing how container gardening is the perfect way to maximize your small space and still grow those flowers, herbs, and most of the vegetables that you love. First, a little bit of housekeeping. So all the videos and microphones are off except for the presenters. If you have any questions, you can enter them into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. And we will have time at the end of the presentation in order to go through all of those that haven't been addressed throughout. We've got about a little bit over an hour for presentation and then about 20 to 30 minutes for Q&A at the end. This presentation is recorded and it will be available for 30 days afterwards. In a couple days, you'll get an email with the link in it to this webinar, along with any other links that JoAnne might reference throughout her presentation. And today our presentation is given by JoAnne. She's lived here in Central Oregon for almost 20 years. She has used container gardening in her own home for years, and she's been a certified Master Gardener volunteer for the last 17 years. And she loves to see new gardeners be successful in their own home gardening. So now we're going to turn it over to JoAnne. And then I will stop sharing. Go ahead, JoAnne, whenever you're ready.
Okay. Nice to meet all of you. I am going to be talking about container gardening and small space gardening, but want you to know that I won't be talking about raised beds as far as small gardening areas. That raised bed gardening and irrigation is a different webinar that's coming up, I believe. Yes, it's April 15th in the morning, so you might want to look for that. But let's get started and talk about container gardening. I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to stop my video because I want you all to pay attention to what's on screen and not my face. So off we go. Okay, container and small space gardening. Let's start with the overview of the presentation. We'll be talking about the advantages of container gardening, the types of containers, soil mixes, design tips, planting and care of your plants and the containers, and examples of annuals you might want to use. In the resource links that you will get after the presentation, there's a link. It's the very first one on the references, and it has many examples of annuals that you could use, but be aware that you're sort of at the mercy of the local nurseries as to what annuals and perennials they have. But just know that you'll have some of those resources to look at. So some of the advantages of container gardening, some of them are listed on this slide. But taken together, they make a really compelling argument for gardening in containers if you haven't done so before. It can be a great choice for the gardeners with limited mobility, limited space, and limited time. But let me assure you that you can spend as much time as you want on your containers or your small space garden. It's all up to you. So you know you're a gardener when everything you see becomes a planter. A couple of friends and I were out for a walk last summer, or maybe it was the summer before, and walking along the path, we saw these planters. So it's all in what you think you might want to make as a container. I thought this was very ingenious. So let's talk about containers. There's such a variety out there. They come in all sizes, shapes, and materials. Choosing a container that meets your needs as a gardener and the plant's needs is an important decision in the container you choose. Consider the site that you're going to have your container. Is it going to be in the sun, the shade, part of both? Prevailing wind, the temperature, and then the water retention, the durability, the cost, the suitability for the plants that will go into it, the insulating properties, and weight. So it's a kind of a big decision for you to think about. And as I said, you need to consider your needs, but also the plant's needs. So it's not just about you. You have to think about those plants. So let's talk about the container requirements. The number one thing a gardener should always do is make sure that you have enhanced drainage. Poorly drained pots result in a lack of oxygen in the root zone, and that obviously can promote root rots and otherwise really unhealthy looking plantings and just not attractive. Make sure the holes in the bottom are large enough and insufficient enough number that you can allow quick drainage of that excess irrigation water. You want to raise the pots up on, or your containers, up on blocks or bricks, wheels, or slatted dollies that allow irrigation to the irrigation water to be able to drain well. There are lots of different types of supports that you can find online, but we do encourage, if they're large pots, that you put them, your large containers, on dollies or some way it can be wheeled around. Use of saucers under the pots really impedes drainage and can result in standing water in the pot. And obviously you don't want that. So if you do decide to use saucers, make sure you tip the excess water out each time you water. So there's a little bit extra work if you're using saucers. Well-drained potting soil is definitely essential, but we'll have more on that shortly. Like I said, there are a number of supports that you can get online that will take your container off the ground, especially if you have a deck. You don't want your deck stained with maybe some terracotta color or mold or mildew. So think about those supports. So let's start with terracotta containers. There's an impressive variety. They come in a lot of shapes and sizes. They're attractive. The red-brown contrasts well with a lot of the green foliage that you might be planting. They're relatively inexpensive. The least expensive are called low-fired, which are not as durable as the more expensive high-fired. The high-fired terracotta resist deteriorating effects of the freezing and thawing weather that we have here in Central Oregon. Many of the high-fired terracotta pots come from Europe. They're thicker, they're denser, and usually smoother than the low-fired. And most of the low-fired pots come from Mexico. They're rougher, they're more lightweight, and they really don't survive our Central Oregon winters very well. Terracotta pots are porous, which means they wick away the moisture, and that's probably the biggest disadvantage of terracotta. The porosity of the container, that's the wick away of the container, allows oxygen into the root area, which is a good thing, but it wicks away moisture way too quickly. So terracotta pots really need to be watered and checked very regularly. So a little bit more time consuming. Terracotta is more fragile than some of the others we will be talking about. They chip and they break easily. And when they're wet and planted, they're heavy. So again, think dollies or some sort of casters. And one of the other things we're talking about, the last bullet point, is the mineral deposits. These deposits tend to accumulate on the outside of the pot. And some people find that that's a nice character to add to the pots and the planting, but other people don't like it. They think it's unsightly. And for that latter group, the unsightly group, you know, the easiest thing if you want to use those terracotta pots is to use a wire brush and scrub off those deposits. And we'll also get into cleaning pots a little bit later too. Here's an arrangement of very large terracotta pots. You can see the mineral deposits and probably some moisture marks on them. It's not unattractive, but some people just may not like that. It's a personal choice. These flowers or plants are coxcomb celosia. Very attractive, colorful blooms on these. But note at the bottom of the front terracotta pot, there's a little bit of standing water down there. So that's really not the best thing for the plants. So having those, again, supported would be more beneficial. Let's talk about plastic containers. As you might expect, they're inexpensive. Probably the most inexpensive type of container you'll find out there. They're non-porous, obviously, which means they have good water retention. And that permits much less watering, less frequent. Lightweight, obviously very lightweight. It's a good choice for, say, children and adults with strength issues. They're fairly durable. They usually last for several years. They'll eventually become brittle and crack after being out in the weather for a few winters and summers. They are obvious, I keep saying obviously, but they're poorly insulated. They're very thin. And if you have very cold weather and or very hot weather, it can absolutely damage the roots of your planting. So during winter, you might want to sink the pot into the ground or protect it with insulating material like bubble wrap or a foam blanket, but we'll also talk about that a little bit later too. Some of them are actually quite attractive. Pot manufacturers have gotten better at producing attractive and inexpensive plastic pots. Don't confuse these with the black and green pots used by most nursery growers. They don't provide much accent or contrast to container planting, unless, of course, you put in a lot of trailing plants, which means they hang over the edge and they cover up that pot. But you'll know underneath that you've got that pretty unattractive black or green pot. And by the way, most nurseries do recycle those, so you can always take those back. The next type we're talking about are the synthetics. They're resin or fiberglass. The biggest advantage of these is that they are extremely lightweight, considering their size, and many are also quite durable. They're insulating and attractive. I'm sure actually many of you have been to one of the box stores and seen these and tried to lift one. Well, try to lift it and it probably flew out of your hands. It's so light. The biggest drawback to these are they are quite expensive compared to just a regular plastic container or a terracotta, but they are quite attractive. So we also have wood that we can choose from or glazed. So we'll start with the wood. Usually cedar or redwood will last the longest. And of course, keeping your container elevated off the ground will keep the wood rim from deteriorating or rotting quickly. Wood containers are strong. And as you can imagine, most of those with metal bands surrounding them will stay together better than those that are nailed or glued. Put larger containers again on dollies or casters so you can move them around, because as you can imagine, they will be heavy once they are planted also. And if you're really looking for a really big container made out of wood, a half whiskey barrel is a good choice, and a fairly inexpensive container versus anything else that size. Anything else that size is quite expensive. So cost is always a thing to think about. And the glazed containers, there's lots and lots of variety out there, sizes, shapes, colors. They're durable, and obviously they retain moisture well because they're glazed. The one we have pictured there is glazed obviously on the inside and the outside, so it will retain moisture well. And as there's such a variety of these, it will add character to your planting because of the colors, the variety, sizes, and shapes. They are expensive and they are very heavy. The other thought is that I have is that most of these glazed containers that I've seen do not have drainage holes in them. And as I discussed in the very beginning, drainage is a very important part of all of your container gardening. So keep that in mind. And we have, the Master Gardener Plant Clinic office has been getting more and more questions about using galvanized tubs. They're increasingly popular. They're fairly easy to put together, fairly easy to find. They come in various sizes. You'll need increased drainage, and since it's metal, you might need to irrigate more often in warmer weather. Usually these come with one drainage hole in them, so that's why you need to increase your drainage. Do you need a lining? Well, that's kind of up to you as the gardener. It is galvanized, and that is a chemical process done at the factory. There's a distinct possibility for chemical leaching into your potting soil as you continue to irrigate and as more time goes by. It is it's a personal decision is what I'm trying to say. If you are going to have garden edibles in your galvanized tub, you might want to consider lining. If you're just having floral arrangements or perennials of some sort in there, then that's another personal decision. But be an informed consumer and know that even some tomato cages are galvanized. So, as I said, personal decision, be informed. And lastly, let's talk about wire baskets, hanging baskets. You would want to line your wire basket with layered moss, burlap, or coir, which is also known as cocoa fiber. So you want to find mats that fit the size of your basket. You can cut slits in the liner and insert plants along the sides and the bottom of your basket, which will make it look much more full. We'll talk about peat moss or sphagnum moss in the next slide. So that's why I brought up coir fiber or burlap. Wire baskets give a full round effect that's very attractive and often used in municipal settings like downtown Bend. They have beautiful, beautiful big baskets. And other businesses around town that can accommodate really large baskets. The biggest disadvantage to any basket, really, whether it's large or small, is their tendency to dry out quickly. That's because the liners are so porous, water evaporates from all the surfaces of the containers, 360 degrees around. So the best way to irrigate a large wire basket, or actually even smaller ones, is to have a continuous drip irrigation system available. And for the larger ones, some nurseries that plant these commercially for businesses and cities, they actually require that the buyer install a drip irrigation system. And that's because they fear that their baskets will look terrible and die back if they're not irrigated and fertilized appropriately. And then they'll get a bad word thinking that the baskets just aren't that attractive. But if drip irrigation is not available for you as a gardener, really you need to water baskets several times a day, especially during the hot periods of the summer. They dry out, as I said, they dry out quickly. But downtown Bend has some very beautiful, beautiful big baskets. Okay. Let's talk about peat moss. Our gardeners, nurseries, they've used peat moss for years. It's known to improve drainage and retains water. But what they've found what the scientists have found is that harvesting moss, it adds carbon to the atmosphere and it actually contributes to global warming. Peatlands cover just 3% of the Earth's land, but the peatlands, or the bogs, they store approximately 30% of the Earth's soil carbon. And it's been stored there for 10 to 12,000 years. So harvesting actually releases that carbon into the atmosphere. So that's why we're trying to teach and inform people that using peat moss is really not in our best interest. The people who work the bogs consider it renewable, but even bogs transplanted, it takes centuries to recover to their original state. And the carbon continues to be released into the atmosphere for up to 30 to 40 years while it's trying to regrow itself. The harvesting also destroys the native habitat essential to the survival of many birds, reptiles, insects, and small animals. And that's why I brought up coconut coir. It's also known as coconut fiber. That's the waste product of coconut harvesting, which is renewable. But it has its own disadvantages because the fossil fuel it takes to transport it, and it really has no nutrient value for your potting soil. So if you're looking at potting soil, you might want to, if you make your own, instead of using coconut coir or definitely peat moss, you might want to consider using compost, decomposed manure, some wood chips, leaves, or perlite. Perlite's a product made from lava deposits. As far as your hanging basket, though, you'd want to find a liner that does not include peat moss. So look at the ingredients on your on the pad itself. And on your resource links, I have included a couple of sites for you to look at and read about peat moss if you're so inclined. The important piece of all of this is be creative. Use anything that you think is attractive. And the important part of whatever you use is that it has unimpeded drainage. Drainage, drainage, drainage. This is a picture that something that my father would have done. So that's why I had to show that. And then of course, many of you must have old radio flyers around. You could do this same arrangement using up those things that are just sitting in your garage. So next thing would be container sizes. Containers achieve fuller looks if you plant your plants or your starts closely together. It makes it just look more full. If there's excess space in the container, the potting soil will retain excess water, and that again can encourage root rot. And all else being equal, the size of the container will influence how often you may have to water. Smaller containers obviously have smaller water reservoirs and need to be watered more often. It all depends upon the weather and where you have your container placed. This was a really cute picture. Gardening tip: when you plant a puppy, make sure you choose a container that can comfortably accommodate the full-grown dog. I don't know how they got this pup to lie there, but I'd probably consider this pup a perennial, not an annual. Okay. Let's talk about reusing. My notes are a little bit, here we go. Okay, reusing containers, sorry about that. Most containers can be used more than once. It's always a good question that people raise. Yes, you can use them more than once. To clean them, you'd want to use a 1:9 bleach to water solution. And you would soak your pot in that solution for at least 20 minutes. Clean the pot with soapy water and scrub away the dirt and the mineral deposits and rinse them. Make sure you rinse them well because you want to make sure that bleach solution is gone. For terracotta pots with mineral stains, the best thing to do for those is to soak them in that bleach solution for around 24 hours. then scrub it with a wire brush. And then you want to soak that terracotta or those terracotta pots for another 15 minutes in clean water. Again, you want to make sure that that bleach solution is totally gone. And you just don't, yeah, and since it's a terracotta pot, it will soak up a lot of that solution. So make sure you do rinse them and soak them well before you try replanting. So, potting soil mix essentials. Although at first glance, it may look a little contradictory, but the two most important qualities of good potting soil are that it drains well and it retains moisture. So you've got a sort of a yin and the yang going there. To get both of those, it requires a mix of large and small pore space in your potting medium. So the larger pores actually allow the water to drain, where the smaller pores are the ones that are going to retain that water through capillary action for use by the plants. Be aware of whether there's peat moss in the mix. Again, be an informed consumer and read the ingredients. And if you choose to use peat moss, well, that's your prerogative. Just be aware. Most potting soils are soilless. Garden soil is too heavy, and it doesn't drain well, and therefore it doesn't work well in containers. It also may contain more pests, and sometimes that's why people are moving to container gardens, because their in-ground garden has too many pests that they need to get rid of. So let's go to containers for a year or two. But if by chance you do choose to use garden soil in your containers, it should not make up more than 1/3 of the total in your container. So you'd have 2 parts, 2/3 soilless container soil, potting soil, and 1/3 garden soil. But it's really just best not to use garden soil at all. So now we're going to get into actually designing. And the same design principles that apply to designing any part of your bigger outdoor garden also applies to designing containers. It's just on a much smaller capacity. So consider using a focus, a balance, a form. Think about textures and proportions of plants when designing your container. Probably the most important design principle for your containers is to create contrast within the container by choosing plants with contrasting form, textures, and colors. These contrasts actually allow you and the plants, allows the plants to stand out. At the same time, they create a pleasing blend, like this slide that we're looking at right now. You have it's more than likely a Dracaena. It has rust colors in it, and most of the Dracaenas actually have maybe a chartreuse green line through them, and that contrasts well with the rusty colored container that these plants are planted in, but also the geranium that's there. It's got the lime greenish leaves with the red that contrasts well with the pot itself or the container, and the red flowers set nicely. And the textures, I mean, all of those things have been taken into account with this particular planting. So we were talking about the colors and maybe the flowers and the textures. Well, you can do all of that with leaf textures in one container. In this one, you've got bold, you've got spiky, and you've got feathery or lacy. You have the red color in the caladium. That's kind of the bold part. You've got the spiky, which might be another type of Dracaena. You've got an asparagus fern, and that could be a licorice plant that's the drapey light green plant in the front. I'm not quite sure what the back left is. It could be a type of geranium, but all of this is done with texture. There are no flowers involved with this, so if you don't want flowers, you don't have to have flowers. You can just do textures, which works quite well. So a simple design rule to follow is you have a thriller. You have a filler and you have a spiller. So in this design, the canna lily is the thriller, the top spike, well, it's not spiky, but the very top long, tall plant. And the red flowered begonia is the filler, along with some beautiful coleus. And the third level plantings, the spillers, is a purple potato vine. And it appears that this is a fairly young planting because I know for sure that all of these plants get to be much bigger, and the spiller, the potato vine, usually is much more bushy and can flow much more than this is. But again, look at the design principles that we talked about. The colors, the coordinating colors, the contrasting colors, and it all works well with the gold container. Again, creating contrast with foliage color. This one also has textures in it, but variegated and unusually colored foliage, they've really come into their own. There's so many choices out there. It is possible, like in this photo, this slide, you can create beautiful contrasts simply with foliage. So in this one, they've got repeating and echoing colors in the foliage, and it all ties together. You've got a very pretty coleus right next to a sort of a chartreuse. I have another picture of this as a potato vine also, and I'm not sure what the top plant is, but looking at the texture, it just adds something to the overall planting here. And isn't this a beautiful arrangement? You've got your thriller is a purple millet. The filler, the purple millet is the grassy purple tall planting in the middle. The coleus obviously is the filler, and the spiller is a sweet potato vine. Contrasting colors, like colors, textures are all inclusive here. And I do want to tell you that at the bottom left of the container, when I first looked at this slide, I thought, oh my goodness, there's a dead mouse in that picture. But no, rest assured, that is just a little desiccated coleus leaf, I believe. It is not a mouse, but beautiful arrangement. So here are a couple examples of those sweet potato vines, the purple leaf sweet potato, and in the upper right slide of it combined with, that could be a hollyhock maybe, not quite sure. And then you've got a tricolor sweet potato on the bottom right, but it also has other sweet potato vines there, the purple one, and then a chartreuse, which you will see on the next slide, which is called Marguerite. But as you can see, these sweet potato vines can get quite large and quite bushy. But you also need to take into account what the plant's needs are, whether it's a shade plant or a sun plant. Again, we have to consider what are the needs of our plants. And if all else fails and you can't figure out what colors you should put together, use a color wheel. This is also on my resource list, so you don't need to furiously write down complementary colors or anything like that. It's on the resource list. Again, combining colors is a personal choice. Use complementary colors on the opposite side of the color wheel to each other, or you can use what's called analogous colors. So complementary colors are such as the red and the green, or the blue and the orange, or whatever color just opposite that, the violet and the yellow. Analogous color examples are ones that are adjacent to each other. So red violet with a red. So they're, like I said, they're adjacent to one another. A yellow green and a green. But again, it's a personal choice. You don't have to follow the color wheel. Whatever colors you think look good together, that's what's important, is what you want. Sorry. So you can also use containers as a design element. There are many ways that containers can be integrated into your garden. And here are just a few bullet points that show these as a design element. And don't forget that containers add color to or height to your space, if that's what your garden needs. So the containers will increase the impact of your total area. You can, in this slide, direct traffic. So obviously you're going to be following this path, but the pots will show you which way to go. Marking transitions in the garden. So if you have a pathway going off to your left, obviously there will be an opening there. And it will slow down the visitor. Anybody who comes into your garden and sees all of these containers, they'll want to slow down and look to see what you have planted and what type of pots you've used. And don't forget that to increase the height of some of your plants, you can simply just get other pots and upend them, and that will increase the height. So you could actually have a plant that is considered a filler. If you raise it up high enough, it could be your thriller. So more containers as a design element. They add mention to your garden, as I said. They can hide unsightly views and spruce up an empty space. So as an example of this slide, who knows what's on the other side of that grouping of containers? They could be, there could be maybe a hot tub on at the neighbor's house that they really don't want to look at. Maybe there's a shed there, or just a very bad backyard that they just don't want to look at. Or on the other hand, it just might be a big empty space that they want to fill up with something interesting to look at. And again, this is a design element. You have your thriller, which is that canna lily, the very tallest one. And then you've got your fillers, which are a number of different plants. And then on the bottom, you've got, you've got some spillers down there. But they've also, as you can note, have a number of different types of containers, different textures, different colors, different sizes. Some are elevated, some are not. So they've brought in a lot of these design elements. And containers often have more impact in a group. If this area really, if it didn't have containers, this would be a pillar planted into some cement. This collection of containers really draws you in. I would really want to get up close to this and look at the type of plants. They've got the textures, they've got the colors, coordinating and contrasting. They've got the thrillers, the fillers, and the spillers. And I don't know, there's just so much texture going on in this picture. The containers create contrast for each other, and that increases the overall impact that you're seeing here. Very, very attractive. I wish I had something like that. And this one, it's without these containers, it would be a large blank space. So this calls for a number of containers to be filled in here. Just imagine this with maybe those front, well, maybe that's one container in the front with the rust colored, that could be a flax, a New Zealand flax, or a maybe another Dracaena, but only one container there just wouldn't have the impact that this has. Again, you've got the textures, you've got the different types of containers, you've got the contrasting colors. It just works well, much better than one simple container could do. So let's talk about some planting tips. If a plant requires a moist, shady spot when it's in the ground, it will require a moist, shady spot when it's in a container. So you're not going to change it by changing its spot. Whatever it requires, it will still require that in your container. Many plants will be labeled as good for growing in containers. Usually the seed companies and nurseries are very good at indicating which ones are suited for containers. Usually these varieties are they're smaller, and overall they have more compact root systems. And you'll also find some of these listed in that resource of container gardening, the very first one on the resource list. And you want to moisten your potting soil before you put it into your pot. Dry potting soil is, especially that with a high core content, it's especially hard to re-wet. So make sure to moisten the potting soil before you plant anything with it. By planting into a moist potting soil, the plant roots, they will stay moist and begin transporting water more quickly. Again, when you're moistening your potting soil in a bucket, you don't want it dripping wet. You want to just moisten it enough so when you grab it in your hand and you make a fist, you don't want water dripping out of it. You just want it to maybe adhere a little bit. It might fall apart, but you'll know when it's just moist enough. The other thing is, don't forget to soak your terracotta pots, those would be your porous pots, before planting into them. The porous pots need to be soaked to prevent moisture being wicked away from your newly planted container plants. It's a porous pot. If it's dry and you plant your moistened potting soil into those pots, that dry porous pot will suck that moisture from your potting soil away from the soil before your plant can actually be utilizing that water. And one other important thing is no gravel at the bottom of your container. Many gardeners are surprised to find out that they shouldn't have a layer of gravel, because in the past we've been taught, oh yeah, that's good. That gives you, an extra area for the water to drain out. Well, actually, it doesn't promote drainage. It actually creates sort of a perched water table inside the pot, which seriously impedes drainage. So no gravel at the bottom of your containers. And use a mesh screen, coffee filter, paper towels, rounded pot shard with the rounded side up over your drainage holes. You want to keep that special potting soil from washing out of your container when you water. So you want to cover it with something. Those rounded pot shards are from the terracotta pots that have broken over the years. And like I have up there, make sure the rounded side is up, because you want the unimpeded drain for the water to get out. You can start your containers with seeds, but transplants actually, they produce a more effective and attractive container much sooner than you would if you started with seeds. The other thing with seeds is you're not sure if you're getting them planted or the seedlings will come up close enough the way they should look in a pot. They need to be planted closely together. Always leave 1 inch at the top, an inch, a little more than an inch at the top of the container, so that the soil doesn't wash over the rim during irrigation. Yeah, and fill the container with potting soil to the level where the deepest plant sits. And then as you fill in with the more shallow plants, you would obviously fill in with more potting soil. And as I was trying to indicate, you want to pack your transplants in tightly for a finished look. You don't want a lot of open spaces in your container garden. I'm talking very large containers, those that might be 4 feet tall. If you want to conserve potting soil, fill that container, the bottom part of the container, with packing peanuts and lay a layer of landscape cloth over the peanuts. If you've got a rather large opening for your container, you could actually use empty milk jugs. Whatever you're using, basically you're trying to fill up that space with something other than your expensive potting soil. But then place your landscape cloth over the top of that, and then fill in with your potting soil. And the landscape cloth does let water run through. So you still want to make sure you've got that drainage hole in the bottom of that container, no matter how big or small it is. So hopefully that saves some potting soil. And how about some watering tips? The soil volume in a container is relatively small and dries out quickly in comparison to an in-ground garden. Container plants absolutely need to be watered more often than plants in the ground. container plants in porous containers, if you put them on reflective surfaces, if they're in the direct sun or in a windy condition, any of those, it will require more frequent watering. A 10-inch terracotta pot with one large geranium in it may need to be watered twice a day in the heat of the summer. So again, you need to plan accordingly. And one hot, dry summer day without water can ruin your entire container planting. So be fastidious about where you're going to put your plants or your containers, and what type of what type of plant are you going to put in those containers, and where they're going to be located in the sun, the shade. All of that makes a difference on how much watering you're going to have to do. And this final bullet is kind of a funny one. Don't over or under water your plants. But that being said, most people are overwaterers or underwaterers. So if you tend to underwater, use a plastic or non-porous container. If you tend to overwater, use the more porous containers like terracotta. And with that being said, you need to be honest with yourself. Take a look in the mirror and say, okay, JoAnne, do you underwater or do you overwater? I think I probably underwater my containers. So make sure you water. This is where containers, they take up time, but you need to check them, and you need to stick your finger in the top and say, okay, is the top 1 inch plus of my potting soil dry? If so, then you need to water. You want to water it gently but thoroughly. Water it gently so that your soil doesn't fly out of the top. But you also want to have that irrigation water come through your drainage holes. Wet the entire container, at least until it's running, the water's running out of the drainage holes. And if you've got porous pots, it wouldn't hurt to water the outside of the pots too. It would keep the pot from taking the water out of the soil. So let's talk fertilizers. There's slow release fertilizers, there's fast release fertilizers, there's organic fertilizers. Slow release fertilizers are excellent alternatives to soluble fertilizers, aka fast release. Because the nutrients are released at a slower rate throughout the season, your plants would be able to take up more of the nutrients without waste by leaching. And by leaching, I mean when you water with a fast release, a lot of times that fertilizer will flow through your potting soil and out your drainage holes. So it's leaching out. A slow release fertilizer, they're usually more convenient and easy to use since you have to apply less frequently. And fertilizer burn usually isn't a problem with slow release fertilizers. Even if you put too much of an application in with your planting, it's still important though to follow the directions on the container. Always follow the application recommendations. Realize that slow release fertilizers may be more expensive than the soluble types. So an example of a slow release could be Osmocote, Miracle Grow, Shake and Feed. There are many types out there. I'm just mentioning just a few. And these can also, they are also available in organic forms. Fast release examples are like fish emulsion, those that you dilute, and those that are ready-made liquids. With regard to fertilizers, many of you may know that there are 3 numbers that are associated with fertilizers. And if you look at the earthworm casting picture on the bottom right, you'll see the numbers 100. Those numbers relate to nitrogen as the first, phosphorus as the second, and potassium as the third. If you have flowering containers, you want to find a fertilizer that has a high middle number. The high middle number, or the phosphorus, promotes blooming. The first number is nitrogen, and the potassium is for overall plant health. But in a flowering situation, you want to find one with a high middle number. So what can be planted in a container? Just about anything you want. Annuals, perennials, trees, shrubs, aquatic plants, herbs, grasses, small fruits, vegetables. Most plants can be grown in a container, at least for some period of time. Some have special care requirements. Others will need to be transplanted into the ground eventually. So obviously we're talking about perennials and trees and shrubs in that respect. But some varieties are particularly well suited to container planting. As I mentioned earlier, your seed companies and the nurseries will all be able to tell you whether or not a plant is suitable for container planting. In this particular slide, check out the Swiss chard that's growing in the middle of this container. So as the Swiss chard, it gets harvested, the petunias will fill in around the bare spots. In this respect, you've got well, probably you've got 2 annuals there. They're not perennials. So if you want to use annuals, you want to pack your plants tightly, and you want to keep them deadheaded. Deadheading is the same as removing spent flowers. You want to do this because it encourages plants to continue blooming, and it also keeps plants more compact. So if things start looking a little bit leggy and kind of draggy, you can deadhead or even pinch back your annuals. And as I said in the previous slide, annuals need plentiful phosphorus for continuous bloom. That's that middle number on your the 3 numbered items on your fertilizer package. Ideally, the phosphorus should be higher than the percentage of nitrogen. So maybe a 0.50 or a 1.61, whatever you find, that middle number for flowering annuals should be higher. So you can use perennials. It's not a problem. They're good for specimen plants. So in this particular slide that you're looking at, the sedge, I think that's probably the type of grass that's in there. That is your specimen plant. But actually many, if not, well, most perennials can be maintained in a container fairly indefinitely, but you might need to repot that perennial every year or 2 into a larger container. Or if you want to continue using that same container, you'd need to root prune and plant it back into your original container. Root pruning basically has the same effect as reducing the overall size of the plant at maturity. So think of a bonsai. You basically have a perennial that you root prune constantly. The other thing is, if you don't want to root prune, then you just have to realize that you'll have to move that perennial up into a bigger pot in a year or two. Another thing is using containers to confine vigorous or invasive plants in containers. Invasive plants can be a real headache in your garden. So confining them in a container, especially those vigorous plants that you love, it'd be much easier on you in the long run if you contain them or confine them in a container. So those with rhizomatous roots and other invasive qualities are best put into containers. And if you want them in your garden, then plant them in a container and then plant that container in the ground. And that will help at least until the pot breaks or the rhizomes actually escape from the pot into your garden. So I'm thinking of mint is fairly invasive, a bloodgrass, and bamboos. Bamboos are so attractive, but so invasive. Not all, but most. Again, deadheading and pinching back by removing those dead flowers promptly. It'll prevent the plant from putting a lot of energy into making seed. And in annuals, this promotes additional flowering and bushing out if you deadhead. Again, if you want to save the seeds from the particular plant that you love, then don't deadhead, because if you deadhead, you won't have a seed pod. But know that a lot of energy will go into that seed pod, and your plant sometimes begins looking pretty leggy. Pinching back, as I mentioned, leggy stems, if you pinch those back, it encourages what's called the lateral bud of the plant to break and to put out more branches, if you will. It gives the plant denser, more compact growth habit. So it encourages it to not look leggy. And many of you may want to consider overwintering your perennials. You can use any of these methods to protect the root system during the coldest months, because in those cold months, the roots are much more susceptible to root injury. So you can group all of your containers tightly together. You can wrap them with a foam or other protective layer, blankets, let's see, furniture, moving blankets. You can put them in a cool greenhouse or a garage, use the pot and pot system, bury the pots into the ground or bring them indoors. The pot and pot system, it consists of putting a smaller pot into a larger pot, obvious pot in pot, and then put a layer of insulation between the two pots. So that insulation could be some potting soil, bubble wrap, some of those packing peanuts, those ugly packing peanuts, vermiculite, or even balled up newspaper. Then you could plant the containers into the, or if you don't have that many and you want to dig a hole in the ground, you could bury them into the ground. To me, that sounds like an extra step, and being able to get the pots out of the ground sounds backbreaking to me, but that is a possibility. For those plants, planted containers that you're storing out of the weather for the winter, you want to make sure that they go into storage adequately watered. Now, remember that these perennials actually kind of go into a hibernation during the winter. So you're not going to need to water them as much as you would during the summer, obviously, because the sun's not heating them up. You do want to keep them a little bit moist, so you will have to check them just for sufficient moisture. The last thing is, you could bring them indoors if you want, but I would suggest that you put them in sort of isolation, maybe in your garage for a week or so, week to 10 days. Excuse me, let me take a drink of water. Pardon me. Put them in isolation. You want to make sure that you're not going to bring extra bugs into your house or critters, or, if you have a spare bedroom that you have no other plants, you could do that, but just be careful that you're not bringing anything into your house that you don't want. So trees and shrubs, those work well in containers, especially if you use dwarf or small varieties. Again, your nursery person will be able to tell you if it's not mentioned on the description whether or not they're dwarf or appropriate for container gardening. You want to make sure that your container is wider than it is tall for stability. Again, think of casters or dollies if you plan on moving those containers. Think non-porous containers. They won't absorb the water, so they're more suitable for trees and shrubs. Meaning you'll have less watering to do during the summer months, and they're more durable if they're going to be outside during the winter. And if you're going to plant a tree or a shrub that's 4 to 5 feet tall, use a 15-gallon or bigger container, and use a 30-gallon container for an 8-foot tree or shrub. Again, be cognizant of where you're going to put these containers, because they will be extremely heavy. And what about water gardens? Not a bad idea. I've never done one, but it would be intriguing. Water gardening is a great way to try out the idea of water gardening without committing to a larger, more permanent pond. I hadn't thought about that. So instead of getting a water feature, you could do a container water garden. It's also a good way for the committed container gardener to broaden your horizon. So most of these water gardens don't require special filtrations or pumping, although many of us actually like to see movement in the water. In that case, you'd want to get a pump, and also realize that moving water is certainly more attractive to wildlife than still water. So some of this seems pretty clear. You'd want to use a watertight container. Yeah, so don't use a terracotta pot. Anything that holds water can be used as a container. Anything you want, be creative again. Ideally, they suggest that you have a container that holds 15 to 25 gallons of water, but you can go as small or as big as you want. Keep in mind, though, that water weighs 8 pounds per gallon. So citing where you're going to have that container is really important. And before you fill it, because once you fill it, it's going to be heavy. And really, I wouldn't even suggest putting them on dollies or casters because, you know, when you're trying to move a pot that's full of water, you spill the water all over the place. So think about where you're going to put your water garden and make sure you're just going to leave it there. Also important is make sure the container sits in a sunny location because most water plants like 6 or more hours of direct sun a day. So keep the siding, the place you're going to put your water garden, keep in mind that it needs mainly full sun. And yes, my dears, you can put vegetables in containers. They can be aesthetically pleasing, a practical addition to your container gardens, not just flowers. Most vegetables can be grown in containers if the containers are large enough and the variety is thoughtfully selected. And in this picture, you'll see not only are they growing peppers, but they're also growing marigolds. But you're seeing the colors and the textures and the contrasts as we described in designing a container. So it may be vegetables, but you can still do it. And it is an excellent alternative for maybe kids because you've got, you know, it's right there. You don't have to go to a special garden. It's good for limited space, limited time, and mobility. And here are just a few examples of some fruit, some vegetables and fruit. You've got the tomatoes in the whiskey barrels, excuse me, got lettuces in containers. You have summer squash. This is definitely a container squash. I have grown container squash in my garden in containers. And they're very interesting plants because they grow straight up. They don't have the leggy arms that go out like watermelon and the like. And then of course on the bottom right, very colorful, of course, we've got tomatoes, peppers, and flowers. All very tastefully done. Oops. Let me go back. Okay. Leafy vegetables that can tolerate are those that can tolerate some shade are like lettuce, greens, cabbage, bok choy. And then there are root vegetables that need 5 to 6 hours of direct sun. Like root crops such as radishes, beets, onions, turnips, and vegetables that require more than 6 hours direct sun include fruiting crops like cucumbers, peppers, tomatoes, and eggplants. So again, you need to be cognizant of the need of sun for the plants. Again, they're not going to change their needs because they're in a container versus in the ground. And this planting here in this slide is very attractive again, because you've got contrasting containers and textures. Again, the design elements are there. And you want to plant shallow rooted crops in containers at least 10 inches wide and 8 inches deep. Only a few vegetable crops can tolerate a smaller container and still be productive. You need to have room for their roots. However, many vegetables will produce in a container of 5 gallons or more. So make sure your containers are definitely big enough. For crops with the larger root systems, such as tomatoes, use those half whiskey barrels or bushel baskets. Definitely something with at least a 5-gallon capacity. Remember also that if you're going to have those bigger plants like tomatoes can grow, you'll want to support the tomatoes with the tomato cage, and you'll want to have a wider and very supportive pot so it doesn't fall over. And choose varieties carefully, the seed company recommendation, compact varieties, and early varieties. The seed companies in the nursery people will definitely help you more. The early varieties are often more compact because they reach their mature size more quickly. And most importantly, have fun. Now I'm going to go through some pictures of some annuals. Realize that you are at the mercy of your local nursery as to what annuals they have around, but many of these will work well in your gardens or your containers. There we go. Lobelias, snapdragons, straw flowers, bacopa. Many of these would be considered fillers. The ornamental cabbages come out in the fall. There's the celosia we spoke of earlier, and the plume celosia on the right. Very attractive. Coleuses are just any colors and sizes and shapes. Ornamental peppers are beautiful. Baby's breath. And you can find any size sunflower you want nowadays. The teddy bears are, I think, one of the smallest. There's your licorice plants, good trailers, spillers, excuse me. You've got impatiens that can be spillers and the others that can be fillers. Your marigolds, your vincas, the moss roses, those can all be spillers. Petunias, wave petunias, beautiful, beautiful bright colors. And your geraniums, you have spillers and you have fillers. Pansies, sweet alyssum, medallion flowers, flowering tobacco, nasturtiums, zinnias and creeping zinnias. The castor bean is a very large plant, so that would definitely be a thriller, but realize that they are very maturity-wise, they are very big plants. And if you're looking for purple, you could just go to a purple sweet basil. Your dusty millers do well here in Central Oregon, and so do salvias, verbenas, and lastly, your limitation, it's only your imagination. And with that, I am going to start my video and we can talk about questions.
Okay, thank you, JoAnne, for all of that fantastic information. Touched on a lot of different things, and I'm sure a lot of people have will benefit from that information. We do have several questions that have come in, so I'll just go ahead and start with those. Cheryl has asked, what is a good lining material for galvanized tubs?
Well, you know, that's a really, really good question, because some people don't like to use plastic, but there are, I believe there, I'm going to say polyurethane. I don't know if that's the correct term or correct description, but they're wherever you get your galvanized tub, they would probably be able to help you with a liner. Some people don't want to use plastic, and It could be a landscape cloth, but eventually that would break down itself. So you'd have to put in a new liner. So actually, I would talk with wherever you purchase your galvanized tub.
Okay. Next question. Diane is asking about your thoughts on potting soil labeled to retain water. Do you feel like that's helpful?
Oh, absolutely. You need some potting soil that retains water. That's a really important, but it also has, as I said, it really needs to have good drainage also. So yeah, if it does say that it retains water, that's fine. I hope that answers her question.
I think it should. Next question, another soil question. Susan is asking, can you use soil used in last year's pot?
Eventually, you will need to move on from that soil, but if you really want to reuse the soil, I would say yes, maybe 1 year, or actually use half of it. Get rid of half of it and replenish it with half. It's always a little bit better if you start fresh each year, but that ends up getting expensive, to be honest. So it's also your discretion, but you'd also need to obviously add some fertilizer too.
Okay. Susan is asking, what do you mean by compact growth habit? Can you explain that a little bit for?
Oh, sure. So compact growth habit is your root system is just more compact. So you're not going to get big, fully grown. So if you're using a perennial and your perennial is at a mature size, I'll just say it's supposed to be 4 feet tall. Well, if you want it to be in a compact growth habit, if you will, then you would root prune it, and it would keep it at a smaller size because you're not allowing that plant to get to its full mature size. Or if you're going to buy a plant that has a compact growth, it just doesn't take up as much space as a full-grown plant. It's more like a dwarf plant.
Okay.
Hope that helps.
Therese is asking, how will Japanese maples do in containers in Central Oregon? And if they do well, can they stay outside over the winter?
Yes and no. Japanese maples are tender plants, and if they're in a protected area, then yes, they can be in containers. Yes, they can be here in Central Oregon, but they certainly have to be in a protected area.
Okay. Dale is asking for some suggestions on container plants that might be not attractive to deer. Suggestions?
I'm sorry, I shouldn't laugh, but as mentioned in the presentation, if a plant is designated as deer resistant in your garden, it will be the same as in your container. So daffodils are really good. Dusty Miller is, I know, good. Tulips are not, but basically anything that you find in the nursery or the seed catalogs that say deer resistant, that would be the same in your container. Realize that it's only a resistance, it's not deer proof.
Okay. Jennifer is asking if a self-water is a good idea to use. She's talking about kind of the glass bulbs that go into the soil, or a 2-liter jug with holes in it that slow release water. Do you recommend that?
Well, I've never tried that. That's a really good question. You know, one thing that I do every year is an experiment, and that would be a really good experiment. I don't see why it wouldn't work. One thing I would worry about is if it would overwater the plants. So I'm sorry, I really don't have a good answer.
Maybe one of the projects this summer could be looking into that a little bit more.
Right.
Testing. Okay, so about 3 more questions. We're getting
Sure.
toward the end. Karen is asking about keeping water in a saucer, if that kind of is helpful, leaving some of that water in the base to help with the humidity of certain plants, or is it better to just kind of water and get that water out?
It's better to get that water out, because if you leave that water in the bottom of your saucer, you're just leaving enough moisture in there. It could lead to root rot in your plantings. It's just better to water more frequently and get that irrigated water down in through the drainage area. And again, if it's a terracotta pot or anything that's porous, make sure, go ahead and water the outside of the pot also, because it will help not dry out as quickly.
Okay, let's see. Someone else has asked about using coconut coir in a standing container versus a hanging container.
Say again.
They're asking about using a coconut coir, COIR, in a standing container versus a hanging basket.
Okay, yeah. So what you would do, yes, you don't use coconut coir or coir by itself. You would definitely want to have it mixed in with your other soil parts. On my resource link, there is a link to making your own potting soil. And yes, using coconut coir is fine, along with maybe some leaves that are decomposing, basically some other organic material, because coir has no nutritional value. It would just help with the retention of water. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, I think it does. 2 more questions. Someone is asking what your opinion is regarding fabric pots, and they're saying specifically for growing vegetables.
Oh, yeah. I didn't mention those, did I? Very, very useful. They work well. I've seen them used with potatoes. Actually, it works really well with potatoes. It would work okay, probably for any vegetables, because of the size of them. They're, I know they're various sizes, but sure, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, and last question is from Judith. She says that her inside palm had a case of scale, which she treated with neem oil. She thinks she got rid of the scale, but now the leaves look like they're bleeding sap. She tried rinsing them with water, and they still look like they need help. Do you have any suggestions on what she might be able to try?
Well, I'm not surprised, number one, that she found scale. That's a common problem. I don't know about the sap. If it's kind of a sappy material, I would check for aphids, but without actually seeing a picture, what we might want to do is have her call into the plant clinic with a current picture, or even go there with the plant if she can carry it. But yeah, that's a common, the scale is a common problem, but she could call the plant clinic at 541-548-6088 and talk to somebody there.
That sounds like great advice.
Great.
Okay, I'll pass it off to Jenny, who will kind of wrap things up.
Thank you so much, JoAnne, for this
Thank you.
lovely participate for our lovely webinar. Everyone, you're going to be receiving some surveys. It definitely helps us improve our webinars. And again, you'll receive all the links and this presentation within the next few days, and you can rewatch it and click on any of the links that you need to share. Thank you so much. We're going to go ahead and end it today. And thank you.
Thanks, everyone.